Hello and welcome back to Indus News with me, Usman Lone. Well, we start this hour with our top news, and that's the United States, where President Donald Trump says the US will keep its military presence in Afghanistan even after a deal with the Taliban. In an interview, he warned that the United States will respond with great force to any attack originating from the country. Currently, there are over 14,000 US troops deployed in Afghanistan. Trump says the number will be reduced to below 9,000, but a permanent presence will remain. The US and the Taliban have been engaged in talks since last year to end the war in Afghanistan. The 9th round of peace talks is ongoing in Doha. Well, in the UK, the government has challenged opponents to bring it down or change the law on Brexit. Leader of the House of Commons Jacob Rees-Mogg says political outrage over the government's decision is phony. More in this report.
Rees-Mogg says the UK will leave the EU without an agreement on October the 31st if the opposition fails to choose. He dismissed criticism of Parliament's suspension by Commons Speaker John Bercow as unconstitutional. Prime Minister Johnson's decision has sparked widespread public and political opposition. A Scottish court has begun hearing a petition filed by 70 MPs on the legality of Johnson's decision to suspend Parliament. Meanwhile, the Conservative government has lost two more important figures. The Chief Whip in the House of Lords, George Young, has quit in protest at Johnson's move. Scottish Conservative leader Ruth Davidson has also stepped down and quit politics.
It is therefore with a heavy heart that this morning I wrote to the chairman of the Scottish Conservative Party to tender my resignation. I explained the changes, both professional and personal, that have prompted this decision. You all know, and I have never sought to hide, the conflict that I have felt over Brexit. Despite that conflict, I have attempted to chart a course for our party which recognises and respects the referendum result, while seeking to maximise opportunities and mitigate risks for key Scottish businesses and sectors.
A public petition has garnered over 1 million signatures since yesterday's announcement. All petitions that receive over 100,000 signatures are considered by Parliament for debate.
Well, for more on this story, we're joined by David Hearn, who's a UK-based analyst. David, thank you for joining us here. I mean, the first question would obviously be the backlash. And considering the backlash over the suspension of Parliament, what options are available to Prime Minister Boris Johnson to avoid a political crisis?
Well, I think it's fair to say that there are already a number of challenges underway to the Johnson government. There are 3 legal challenges that I know of going on. One, as you say, is being heard in Scotland now. There'll be a second one heard tomorrow in Northern Ireland, and a challenge in England. So in terms of Johnson's government, I think it has already sparked something of a crisis. I think MPs who oppose him will seek immediately to try and bind his room for manoeuvre as soon as they return on the 3rd of September.
David, the leader of the House of Commons, Jacob Rees-Mogg, has asked opponents they have 2 choices, and that's if they want to change the law or change the government. Which one of these is likely to happen, if at all?
Possibly. It's certainly the timing of all of this has been rendered very, very difficult indeed by Johnson's decision to prorogue Parliament, which I think, to be absolutely honest, was the intention. I suspect that he has gone into this with the express intention of doing that. Now, what the end result will be is very difficult to say, but as you allude to, ultimately it might be the case that his opponents choose to bring down the government.
David, the public have also spoken out, and there's been a petition, and that's gained over 1 million signatures. Now, this is passing the threshold to be considered for a debate in Parliament. Do you think this could have an impact on the Brexit debate?
I think that the petition will be more an expression of feeling rather than having any kind of concrete impact on its own. Certainly 1.5 million, I think that's more or less where the tally is now, signatures is a very impressive number, as it was only launched yesterday. I fully expect that number to continue to grow. There was a petition earlier this year that reached around 7 million, so they may be looking to see if they can surpass that figure. But I think that's much more an expression of feeling and an expression of the deep anger that many people feel at this decision, rather than doing anything concrete to reverse it. For that, we'll need some kind of legal intervention or something on the part of Parliament.
Well, thank you very much, David Hearn, for joining us here on Indus News. Now, moving on to Pakistan, which says India's plans to change the demography of occupied Kashmir is a war crime under the Geneva Convention. Adopted in August 1949, the convention protects the rights of civilians during conflicts. In a series of tweets, Prime Minister Imran Khan said killing Kashmiris is part of India's genocidal agenda. Khan criticised the crushing curfew imposed in occupied Kashmir and India's illegal annexation of the disputed territory. Earlier, Foreign Office spokesperson Mohammad Faisal said the Organisation of Islamic Cooperation's Kashmir Contact Group is likely to meet in September. The Foreign Office said the meeting will discuss the worsening situation in occupied Kashmir. He said Foreign Minister Shah Mahmood Qureshi will brief the UN Human Rights Council on Kashmir very soon. Faisal went on to say that Pakistan will only accept a UN Security Council-backed Kashmir solution. And staying with Pakistan, and they have successfully carried out a night training launch of its surface-to-surface ballistic missile called Ghaznavi. Pakistan's military spokesman says the missile is capable of delivering multiple types of warheads at a distance of 290 kilometers. Prime Minister Imran Khan has praised the team involved in the successful test. Now, India leads the world in the number of internet shutdowns, according to a US non-profit group called Freedom House. Over 170 internet blackouts have been imposed on occupied Kashmir since 2014. New Delhi's latest lockdown and communication blackout in occupied Kashmir has entered its 25th day. Freedom House says New Delhi usually cuts internet services ahead of expected dissent over its actions. India uses the British colonial-era Indian Telegraph Act of 1885. The body's executive director Sundar Krishnan says the communication blackouts bring modern society to a grinding halt. He went on to say that the shutdowns have a compounding effect, disrupting businesses and education and demoralizing the people. Now, Palestinian President Mahmoud Abbas says the United States is not playing a constructive role in the Middle East. Meeting Abbas in Berlin, German Chancellor Angela Merkel said only a two-state solution can bring peace to the region. More in this report.
Palestine has called for international involvement to resolve long-standing issues with Israel through dialogue. President Mahmoud Abbas said the U.S. wants to remove key issues, including Jerusalem and refugees, from the Israel-Palestine talks.
We call for international accompaniment in the negotiations on the basis of what I suggested to the UN Security Council, a Middle East quartet with European and Arab states to accompany negotiations between us and Israel.
German Chancellor Merkel said a political solution must be pursued so that Palestinians and Israelis can live together in peace.
In our opinion, that is only possible through a two-state agreement between the conflicting parties, under the consideration of internationally agreed upon parameters. That must be the goal as before.
Earlier, the U.S. said it will not release the political portion of its peace plan for Israel and Palestine before Israeli elections in September.
Yemen's southern separatists have regained control of Aden after intense clashes with government forces. The separatists retook control of the port city after government coalition forces recaptured the city just yesterday. The Southern Transitional Council says it has taken over all entrances to Aden. The separatists originally seized the interim capital earlier this month. Spokesperson Haitham Nazar said STC forces will now advance on the government-held provinces of Abyan and Shabwa. They were retaken by government troops earlier this week. 16 people have been killed in a Syrian government airstrike in northwestern Idlib province. The Syrian Observatory for Human Rights says 6 children were among the victims of the raid. Monitors say air raids provided cover for a ground assault on rebel-held Marat al-Numan. This town is on the strategic highway between Damascus and Aleppo. Government forces seized the nearby rebel stronghold of Khan Sheikhun last week. Meanwhile, Syrian warplanes have hit rebel positions close to a Turkish military observation post inside Idlib. Turkey says it will not allow the US to delay its plan to set up a security safe zone in northeast Syria. In an interview, President Recep Tayyip Erdogan warned a holdup will force Turkey to take unilateral action. President Erdogan says Turkish ground forces will soon enter the planned safe zone. He also has spoken on the telephone to US President Donald Trump about the ongoing battles in Idlib province. In a statement, the Turkish presidency said the two leaders agreed to protect civilians caught up in the fighting. In the meantime, the US Defense Secretary Mark Esper has expressed hope that Turkey will abandon an arms deal with Russia. The US excluded Turkey from its F-35 warplane project in July after it took delivery of the Russian S-400 air defense missile system. Now, senior American officials have distanced the US military from a series of alleged Israeli drone strikes in Iraq and Syria. US Defense Secretary Mark Esper and Joint Chiefs of Staff German General Joseph Dunford held a briefing in Washington today. They said the US had nothing to do with the recent attacks. The US Defense Secretary said they are working with and through Iraqi forces against militants. Iraq has expressed concern about Israeli attacks, calling them a violation of its sovereignty. In the meantime, displaced Iraqis living in refugee camps around the country are being sent home despite continuing violence. Now, Iran says the US will have to think of the 2015 nuclear deal if it wants to talk. Speaking in Kuala Lumpur, Foreign Minister Javad Zarif said Iran won't engage unless the US stops its economic terrorism. The Iranian foreign minister said sanctions must be lifted if any new negotiations are to begin. He went on to say that Iran is only interested in a result-orientated meeting. Zarif announced Iran will fast-track legal action against a British oil tanker Tehran seized last month in the Strait of Hormuz. He also denied accusations it was behind attacks on 6 tankers in May and June. The Iranian foreign minister is on a 2-day official visit to Malaysia. The EU says it will back talks between the US and Iran, but only if the nuclear deal... Sorry, I think we've gone past that story already. Should have another one now. Here we go. She called on all aspects. We're talking about Security Council resolutions, including the nuclear agreement, and that's Mogherini. She's attending a meeting of EU foreign and defence ministers in the Finnish capital. NATO and the UN representatives are also taking part. Maritime security and the Middle East are also on the agenda for EU ministers at the meeting. Apart from Britain, there has been little European enthusiasm for Washington's proposed naval flotilla in the Gulf. Earlier, US Defense Secretary Mark Esper reiterated President Donald Trump's call for Iran to negotiate. But Iranian Foreign Minister Mohammad Javad Zarif insisted Washington must respect the 2015 deal and lift sanctions. Violent protests once again erupted in Indonesia's eastern region of Papua. Angry protesters set fire to a regional assembly building and damaged businesses in Jayapura city. Papua is marred by civil unrest for the past 2 weeks over mistreatment of students and ethnic discrimination. Demonstrators demand the right to self-determination and an end to racism in Papua. More than 1,200 police and military personnel were deployed to the region last week. A day earlier, a clash between protesters and security forces reportedly killed a soldier and 2 civilians. Moving on to Hong Kong now, where the Chinese military has begun deploying fresh forces in Hong Kong amid massive anti-government protests. China's state media described the move as a routine annual rotation. It says the troops will carry out their duty to defend Hong Kong's sovereignty, security and progress. This is the 22nd rotation of Chinese forces since Beijing took control of Hong Kong from Britain in 1997. The fresh deployment comes days ahead of another scheduled protest march on Saturday. A US Navy ship has sailed into the South China Sea amid trade tensions between Beijing and Washington. A US official says an Arleigh Burke-class guided missile destroyer conducted the operation. He says the operation was carried out to challenge excessive maritime claims and preserve access to waterways under international law. The busy waterway is a flashpoint in the US-Chinese relationship. The US accuses Beijing of militarizing the South China Sea. In Italy, President Sergio Mattarella has given Prime Minister Giuseppe Conte the mandate to form a new government. Earlier, Conte's Five-Star Movement and the Democratic Party formed a coalition, derailing the far-right League's parties to bid to seize power. Mattarella met with Conte today to officially designate him as Prime Minister. Conte says the new administration will work on drawing up a budget and preventing sales tax hikes. It will also draft the agenda for the new ruling coalition and appoint a cabinet. PD and Five Star have avoided a snap election, but they disagree on many policy matters. The coalition deal was settled 2 weeks after the League party withdrew from the Conte-led government. But League leader Matteo Salvini says the new ruling setup is unlikely to last. Now, staying with Interior Minister Matteo Salvini, and he signed a decree to ban another migrant rescue ship. The charity Mediterranean Saving Humans says the ship Mare Jonio is carrying 100 people. They were picked up off the Libyan coast yesterday. Among their number are 22 children and 8 pregnant women. The survivors say 6 people had drowned before the Mare Jonio came to their aid. Italy's anti-migrant Interior Minister Matteo Salvini has banned a number of rescue ships in recent months, but he will not be part of the new Italian government scheduled to take power today. In Ukraine, President Volodymyr Zelensky has proposed Olysky Honcharuk as Prime Minister. 35-year-old Honcharuk is a lawyer and has little political experience. The newly elected Ukrainian parliament met for the first time and took oath in Kiev. A majority of lawmakers belong to President Volodymyr Zelensky's party. Zelensky's party won 254 out of 450 seats in July's polls. A group of former rebels from the Revolutionary Armed Forces of Colombia says it's taking up arms again. The new offensive was announced 3 years after the group signed a peace accord with the government. A former rebels commander said the resumption of hostilities is an answer to Bogota's betrayal. The group will seek to coordinate with the fellow leftist rebels of the National Liberation Army. President Ivan Duque was elected last year with a promise to modify the accord, but failed to draw support for it. Now, Cuba has asked Canada to help end US sanctions on Venezuela. The foreign ministers of the two countries have held 3 meetings since May on Caracas' impending crisis. Cuba's Foreign Minister Bruno Rodriguez and Canada's Chrystia Freeland met in Havana. In a tweet, the Cuban foreign minister called the US sanctions on Venezuela a violation of international law. Rodriguez said Washington's coercive measures against Caracas have damaged millions of Venezuelan lives. Canada's foreign ministry says the two sides will stay in contact and continue to exchange views over Venezuela. More than 50 people have been abducted in a raid on a village in northwest Nigeria. Residents say the kidnapped people include pregnant women and children. A man who was seized but released by the attackers say at least 53 people were taken. Residents say they have already received ransom demands from the kidnappers. They say the attackers have also taken sheep, goats and food. Nigerian police say 15 women were abducted and 10 others were freed after a gun battle with the assailants. They say search parties have been sent into the surrounding bush to rescue the remaining victims. Now, around the world, measles cases have risen 3 times faster than last year. The World Health Organization says the record number of cases for August has only happened once before, in 2006. More in this report.
The World Health Organization says there were almost 90,000 cases of measles in 48 European countries in the first 6 months of 2019, more than double the number in the same period in 2018. Based on the 2018 data, the disease is no longer eliminated in the UK, Greece, the Czech Republic, and Albania.
What we're trying to communicate to you and out to the world is we are backsliding. We are on the wrong track.
Nearly 365,000 cases have been reported globally this year. The UN Health Agency says the figure is the highest it has been since 2006. The agency says it represents only a fraction of the 6.7 million estimated cases annually.
There are absolutely families, communities, people who are subject to misinformation. They have the wrong information about not only the disease severity and the risks of disease. They don't understand the truth of the matter, but they also have misinformation about the effectiveness of vaccines and the safety of vaccines.
Trust in vaccines is highest in poor countries but weaker in wealthier ones, which has allowed the outbreak to persist. Some 60% of patients in Europe in the first half of 2019 were under the age of 19.
Now, royal families around the world are known to be dignified, but a century after the abolition of the German monarchy, the fight to reclaim family heirlooms continues among the descendants of royalty. More in this report.
Over a century ago, the House of Hohenzollern was Germany's royal ruling family. They lost power at the end of the First World War, but kept their properties in the country, while the ex-Kaiser was exiled in Belgium. After conquering Germany in 1945, the Soviets confiscated everything, and the Hohenzollerns want it back. At stake are fabulous palaces and thousands of priceless artifacts and artworks. The biggest prize up is the right of residence in Sicilienhof Palace near Berlin, site of 1945 Potsdam Conference.
In the 1926 treaty, a right of permanent residence was granted for the family of the Crown Prince and then the head of each family, a right guaranteed by the treaty. If you sit around a table and discuss all the claims, this is of course a legal position on which lawyers should in principle negotiate. This does not necessarily mean that you want to move into the castle.
The Hohenzollerns were kings of Prussia from 1701 and ruled Germany from 1871 to 1918. At the core of the ongoing fight is the accusation that Kaiser Wilhelm II was instrumental in starting World War I. Under a 1994 law, people whose property was expropriated by Soviet Union have a right to claim compensation. But this only applies if they did not lend considerable support to the Nazi regime.
There is a debate among historians about the controversial link between the Crown Prince and Nazism. Most of them still believe that there was a very strong link between the Nazi Party and the Crown Prince, although he was never a member of the party.
The wrangle may go on for years, but that's not much after a century-long dispute and a millennium of family history.
Welcome back to Indus News. Now let's take a look at the world of business. Now, Japan has warned African leaders against accumulating too much debt. Prime Minister Shinzo Abe says Tokyo is promoting quality infrastructure and exports and investment in Africa. Abe says if partner countries are in debt, it interferes with everyone's efforts to enter the market. He was addressing leaders from African nations at a development conference in Yokohama. Abe introduced financing and insurance schemes, and he also announced that Japan plans to train experts in 30 African countries in the next 3 years on managing risks and public debt. Abe claims to boost Japan's presence in the promising African market. Now, South Korea's Supreme Court has ordered a retrial of Samsung Electronics Vice Chairman J.Y. Lee over bribery charges. The court quashed an earlier decision to suspend Lee's 2.5-year sentence and sent the case back to the lower courts. Lee was initially sentenced in 2017 to 5 years in prison. He was convicted of bribing former President Park Geun-hye to take control of Samsung. Lee was freed after a year in detention when the appellate Seoul High Court halved his sentence and suspended it for 4 years. The top court now says the High Court's interpretation of what constitutes a bribe was too narrow. The decision has revived legal uncertainty around the country's largest company, just as it's navigating the turmoil in global trade. European stock markets are trading more than 1% higher on soft inflation data. Showing consumer price rises in Germany and Spain, they've boosted hopes of a European Central Bank stimulus in September. Most Asian stock markets have closed practically unchanged amid pessimism about trade talks between the US and China. Traders say global investors are nervous because long-term US and German bond yields are close to record lows. Many economists see the inverted bond yield curves as evidence of a forthcoming economic downturn. Those worries have sent many investors scurrying back to safe havens, pushing up the price of precious metals like gold, silver and platinum. Well, it's 36 degrees here in Lahore, but let's take a look at the weather around the world. Well, that's all for now, but I'll be back on the top of the hour with the news headlines. Thank you for watching and bye-bye.